Well, welcome to the Saltzman Forum on behalf of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and with gratitude to our late benefactor of the Institute, Arnold A. Saltzman. And is Eric here yet? Eric Saltzman? Anyway, the subject of today's forum has been about number one in the news for some time, and it's coming to a head, so today's event is, as the cliche goes, particularly timely. Will the Iran nuclear deal achieve its objectives if it's approved? Will it make things worse if it doesn't work? What are the costs and benefits in associated issue areas? There are lots of questions and contending answers about what the facts are, what predictions are less dubious than others, what the consequences of erring in one direction or the other would be, and especially what are the criteria by which judgments on the various questions ought to be made. So we have a distinguished group of well-informed panelists with the range of disagreement among them to reflect on the problem. So to introduce them and ride herd on what I'm certain will be a lively discussion, I'll turn the proceedings over to Professor Robert Jervis. Bob is perhaps the preeminent international relations theorist in political science today. I think even his rivals for the title would rank him in the top few. He's been president of the American Political Science Association, received numerous awards for professional accomplishments. He's long provided public service as a consultant in the U.S. intelligence community and as chair of the Historical Review Panel for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's well known for his work on psychology and international politics, theories of nuclear deterrence, and other subjects. And he's the author of 7 books, all of which are relevant to today's subject, but most especially Why Intelligence Fails, Lessons from the Iranian Revolution and the Iraq War, The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution, Perception and Misperception in International Politics, and American Foreign Policy in a New Era. Take it away, Bob.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to give very brief introductions to the 4 panelists so we can get to the subject. They will have 12 minutes. I know they have a lot more to say, but I'll try to follow Dick Betts's lead and be ruthless in cutting people off. We will then have question and answers, but they really have to be questions. I know we've got a lot of strong feelings, which is why the people who set the room up gave us this buffer zone so you can't storm the podium. And I know there are a number of people in the room who know as much, if not more, than many of us up here, but I really do mean it. They have to be questions. I'll give all the introductions, and I'll give them in the order in which people are going to speak. We'll start with the person on my left, known to many of you, Gary Sick, who is a senior research scholar at our Mideast Institute here and an adjunct professor at SIPA, and many students will have taken or will take some of his courses. He's had a long and distinguished career both in the foundation world, in the U.S. Navy, and in the U.S. government, dealing with issues of Iran and the Persian Gulf, and now he's the director of the Gulf 2000 online project that anyone who's really deeply involved in this is familiar with. Following that, we'll turn to Richard Nephew, who's just joined us at Columbia. He's a program director of Economic Statecraft Sanctions and Energy Markets project at the SIPA Center for Global Energy. Before then, he was in several positions in various parts of the U.S. government. No one could hold him for long, but they all dealt with the developing implementation of sanctions, mostly toward Iran. Following that, Stuart Gottlieb, on the far right again, who many of you will know, is an adjunct professor again at SIPA, and before then worked for Chuck Schumer and then Chris Dodd, and on one of the Senate committees. Finally, Danielle Pletka, who we're welcoming to Columbia, is a senior vice president for foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and for a long time she was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee working on East Asia, Near East and South, Near East and South Asia. And she's appeared on on the major media outlets, and her most recent study published by AEI is America versus Iran, the competition for the future of the Middle East. So they'll give them 12 minutes. I may say a few well-chosen words after that. Depending how things go, we may have a couple of minutes for crosstalk and then go to questions. Gary?
Thank you very much, Bob. The deal, the nuclear agreement with Iran, is really controversial only in this country. Basically, all of the members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, plus the European Union, have all signed on to it. They signed it. They went home. They're happy with it, and they're going on about their business. Only here is it being really contested severely. And I think that says something about our politics, and it says something about the nature of where we are in terms of our own position in the world. My bottom line is, and I really don't think it's controversial, though I'm sure there will be those who disagree, that basically this is a successful agreement. I don't want to go into a lot of detail. It's a very detailed agreement, more than 100 pages, highly complex, and I'm hoping that Richard will explain all of that to you in elaborate detail. I'm not going to. But let me just make a couple of points that I think are really significant. First, the agreement removes the heavy water reactor that Iran was developing, which most of the people who know, I'm not a nuclear physicist, but I talked to a lot of people who know what they're talking about, and they said that that heavy water reactor, which produced plutonium, was Iran's shortest route to a nuclear weapon. And they thought that that would be a fixed thing. Iran had gone very far in developing that reactor. They thought that was probably untouchable as far as the negotiations were concerned. And in the end, under a considerable amount of pressure, Iran conceded and, in fact, agreed to take out the core of the reactor and replace it with concrete. So that reactor, which will then be redesigned as a light water reactor, much less threatening, is a major achievement. It has received very, very little attention. If you were an avid reader of the New York Times, the science section 2 days ago had the lead article on it. That's one of the few places that I've seen the issue really discussed. Why? Because it doesn't fit with the prevailing narrative of the critique, which is that Iran gave up nothing and that they really are intending to build a nuclear weapon. The other things that the agreement accomplishes, it places really extraordinary restrictions on the Iranian program. Controls that actually were not applied to any other member country of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Those were, and they truly are exceptional, but because they're exceptional, it was very clear from the outset that Iran would not keep them permanently. So this is not something that they were going to keep indefinitely. They were going to insist that at some point they would revert back to the position of a normal member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that raises the question, of course, which is very, very prominent these days, is what is permanent? Does Iran, at the end of 10 or 15 years, or 20 or 25 years, when the various extraordinary restrictions run out, is it then free to just go for a bomb? Well, there are several things that argue against that. The first is that the additional protocol to the IAEA, which has been accepted by most countries in the world, nuclear and non-nuclear, or non-nuclear states, means Iran must ratify that and all of its parts, and that goes on forever. That is not something that ends at the end of 10 years or 15 years or even 50 years. It is permanent. a lot of people either didn't notice or chose not to notice that in the opening declaration that is made by all the members of the group, Iran said, and I quote this, "Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons." That is a statement that is made in the agreement itself, and it is repeated in the UN Security Council resolution that ratified the argument. Now, obviously, countries don't have to keep their word. Countries can go back on their word. There's been a long argument in certain quarters in the United States that the so-called fatwa that the Supreme Leader had issued saying that Iran would not ever build nuclear weapons was either it didn't exist or you didn't need to pay any attention to it because it had no formal meaning. Well, now Iran has signed an agreement with all the major powers of the world in which they make that concrete and, in fact, hold to it. So, if people want to argue that this is really just a big trick and that Iran is doing all of this just so that it can eventually get to a bomb, they have to ask themselves, if this is such a neat way to get to a bomb, why didn't countries like India or Pakistan or Israel ever think about taking on these restrictions and bringing in inspectors and giving them access to all of their material? The reality is that countries that want a nuclear weapon, in fact, refuse to do any of those things. And the fact that Iran is doing them, some people might regard this as a big trick, but you still have to ask, what were they thinking when they decided to do this? Iran has been and is now a latent nuclear power. They have been for the last 10 years. They've been building up their nuclear capability, and they were within breakout, within basically 2 or 3 months of having enough highly enriched uranium to build a nuclear weapon. And so if you think that Iran is really rushing madly to get a nuclear weapon, you have to ask, why didn't they do it when they had the chance? They basically have a better opportunity right now than probably they'll ever have again in history, and they didn't take it. So do we just reject that, or do we just say, well, we can't explain, the Iranians are incomprehensible? But they have, in fact, ringed themselves into a generation of extreme restrictions that are going to make it extraordinarily difficult for any government there to do anything other than obey. The predictions that Iran was going to have a nuclear weapon began in the early 90s, and people, Mr. Netanyahu made a speech to the Knesset in 1992 in which he said that Iran would have a nuclear weapon in 3 to 5 years if nobody intervened to stop them. Well, that has become a mantra. 3 to 5 years to get a nuclear weapon is just repeated over and over and over. It has been for 30 years or 25 years, and it has never happened. So all of those people who have been making those predictions were all wrong, always wrong. And now we're supposed to believe those same people when they say, well, Iran will get a nuclear weapon in 10 years instead of the 3 to 5 years, and that we could take their word for that. I think we have to ask a question. Finally, the agreement is, of course, not based on trust at all. It is based on a very strong verification, particularly when you combine it with the national technical means available to the United States and others. So what's happened right now is that in the Congress, we're seeing a major case of buyer's remorse. In the House, they negotiated a deal in which there would be an up or down vote, knowing that it would take 60 votes in order to pass the resolution to throw out the agreement. Now that that has actually come, and there aren't 60 votes to do it, there's a lot of parliamentary shenanigans underway to try to do something about that. So if you'll permit me, Bob, let me spend 2 minutes reading the statement, which I thought was really extraordinary yesterday, by New York Congresswoman Louise Slaughter. She's the ranking member of the House Rules Committee. She said, this was on the floor yesterday, she said, "The vote on the Iran nuclear agreement has been touted by the majority as the most consequential of our careers, even of our lifetime. We've had months of considerations, hearings, questions, and open debate following the rules and customs of the House. Today, I met with ambassadors from the P5+1 countries, our negotiating partners. They have a unified voice, embrace the Iran agreement for the incredible achievement it is. Yesterday, we had a hearing in this room that lasted 4 hours. We had testimony from chairs, ranking members of the relevant committees, and we had a robust discussion and a healthy back and forth. We prepared for a rule debate. We went home at about 8 o'clock. But 12 hours later, the dissident wing of the majority's party emerged from a neighborhood bar, Tortilla Coast, and had a different path in mind. They rendered all our work moot. Instead of regular order and a perversion of our legislative process, we are yet again thrown into chaos by a majority chasing its tail at a last-minute meeting, throwing together 3 bills that might as well be scribbled on the back of a cocktail napkin. The bills before us have trivialized our institution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and she ends up and she says, instead of addressing an issue of international global importance, we are occupied with the Republican conference's internal politics, and it is an embarrassment. This dog and pony show has turned our Congress into a stage to play out their internal drama and has left us a laughing stock. If the majority cannot devise a process on a measure they agree unanimously on, I shudder to think what is coming in Act 2. We are days from a government shutdown. We are days from the Federal Aviation Administration expiring, which would ground all flights, crippling our economy. Soon, funding for Perkins loans for low-income college students will dry up. Even so, here we are on the 3rd floor of the Capitol, forced to join in yet another pointless exercise. The Senate will not take up these bills. This nuclear agreement will be implemented, and there's nothing the majority can do about it. To quote Mr. Joseph Welch before Senator McCarthy in 1954, "You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" I thought that was a pretty good statement. So anyway, I'll quit with that.
Thank you, and right on the 1 minute to spare. So
Gee,
Richard is going to read.
I could have stretched it out.
Well, Richard's going to read the JPOA in 13 minutes.
Stand by, it'll be a riveting moment. Thank everybody for being here, and thank for the opportunity to speak to you here. I actually think that Professor Sick did a great job of talking through some of the nuclear benefits of the JCPOA, so I won't belabor them too much. I would just note a couple of key points and then speak to, I think, what we should be getting about now, which is dealing with the implementation challenges that we're going to have as we move forward with this deal. First, I would say that despite what you've heard, the nuclear restraints in the JCPOA are quite significant, they're quite serious, and they will prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon for at least 15 years and potentially beyond that. The key messages here are myriad, but they extend across all of Iran's most likely and most viable paths to nuclear weapons and include significant restraints on uranium enrichment, including both the numbers of centrifuges Iran can have as well as its uranium stockpile. They create key limitations with respect to research and development activities and will hamstring the Iranian nuclear program not only for the 8.5 to 10 years that the restrictions will be in place, but for much longer than that, because of the lag time that will be imposed on Iranian research and development by the restrictions in the first place. As Gary pointed out, it will also deal with the plutonium path to a weapon quite decisively. Iran will not have a reactor capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium for 15 years, and any attempt to build one is going to take a considerable length of time and will be quite obvious to all the rest of us. Beyond that, the Iranians are going to be restrained in their ability to develop the technologies required for separating plutonium from its spent fuel and from using it in nuclear warheads. So from the plutonium path, the deal is quite a good deal and will basically end any reasonable near-term risk of an Iranian plutonium-based nuclear weapon, while on the enrichment side, Iran will be heavily constrained for at least 15 years. And of course, during all of this, there will be the kind of verification and transparency protocols necessary to ensure that if Iran engages in a breakout, we'll know about it, and we'll know about it with enough time to respond. And this includes continuous online surveillance and monitoring of Iran's centrifuges that are operating, its centrifuges that are in storage, the materials required to produce centrifuges, and the uranium that's required to be put through those centrifuges. And so from a verification standpoint, this deal is actually quite effective in constraining Iran's ability to use its fuel cycle for any kind of nuclear weapons purpose. Now, you may have heard a lot of controversy about this idea of 24 days, and I can understand why that seems very scary and very intimidating. But let me just set a couple of assumptions first aside. I think people are under the impression that there was any possible chance of Iran agreeing to anytime, anywhere inspections of the Iraq model. And notwithstanding some misspoken words over the course of the last year, there was no chance. And I think that people were quite clear in communications with Congress that there was no chance that Iran would accept the kind of intrusive monitoring that Iraq was forced to accept throughout the 1990s and after 2003. And we should bear in mind that the anytime, anywhere inspection model that everyone's thinking of was in fact brought to Iraq after the first Gulf War. And it was quite successful, in fact, in preventing a resurgence of Iraqi nuclear weapons ambitions, but that we ourselves did not believe that. And so inspections in and of themselves can provide you with confidence that what you know about is not, in fact, a weapons program, and the ability to inspect places where you think there may be a weapons program. But it does not, in and of itself, solve the problem. This also means that 24 days is not, in and of itself, a material breakdown of the inspections regime. It's all a question of risk. It's a question of opportunity. It's a question of how much the intelligence community can give international inspectors and policymakers to go on. And it's on this basis that I believe that this deal is quite successful, in part because it will contain Iran's ability to stall, which is at present its privilege under the agreements that it's made with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think a lot of people will point to the 24 days and say this is the Achilles heel of the deal. They forget that the Iranians have been stalling access to a place like Parchin for 3 years. So the status quo isn't exactly a perfect solution. Moreover, while a lot of people have pointed to the fact that 24 days gives a lot of opportunity to sanitize a facility, the case that is always brought up to talk about this is a place called Calais Electric, which in 2003, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, asked to go to. And they were denied. And then they were finally let in, but denied the ability to use environmental samples. And this went on for 6 months. But after 6 months of the IAEA insisting to go, it finally was allowed. It was finally allowed to take environmental samples to try and see if there was any uranium traces to be found. And sure enough, that's what, in fact, they did find. So if 6 months of sanitization activities is not good enough to remove all the traces of uranium that could be found in a covert site, how on earth is 24 days? And by the way, I would also note that the Iranians themselves are so intimidated by the IAEA's inspection authorities that the next time the agency asked to go to an undeclared facility, the Iranian response was not to grant access until they had removed the facility from the face of the earth, including about 3 feet of topsoil. A place called Lavazan Xi'an. You can look at it on a number of websites and see the satellite images. And I think, maybe I'm wrong, but if the U.S. intelligence community were to look at a declared facility or an undeclared facility, ask the inspectors to go, and then the Iranian response was to take down the facility, including 3 feet of topsoil, that may just prompt questions as to what the Iranians are doing in the future. I would also note that this deal comes along with sanctions relief that is quite substantial for the Iranians. But frankly, no nuclear deal with Iran was going to avoid substantial economic sanctions relief. It's a hard truth. It may be an upsetting truth. But there is 0% chance that Iran, or frankly any other government, would accept a deal after years of economic pressure, which was explicitly stated to be in furtherance of a nuclear deal, that pressure remaining while other objectives were pursued. And frankly, I think our partners would have a lot to say about that too, considering it is they who sacrificed their own economic interests by pursuing the sanction strategy that we have had in place since the late 1990s. I think a lot of people who are focused on the sanctions relief being too sweet for Iran are upset that they won't get the opportunity to see what strategic economic pressure potentially could do to stop Iranian support for terrorism or violations of human rights. But unfortunately, we already know. The Iranians have been under strategic economic pressure in various different forms since the start of the revolution. And they have continued to support causes that we believe to be terrorism, and they have continued to engage in violations of Iranian human rights, notwithstanding this. It's worth noting that Iran was first named a state sponsor of terrorism in 1984. Iran has been supporting terrorist groups since that time. In 1984, Iran was also locked in the Iran-Iraq War. It didn't have a lot of money to be throwing around in regional adventures, but it did so anyway. And it did so because that was the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they did so because it's frankly cheap. It doesn't take billions and billions of dollars to support terrorism. And the idea that the Iranians will now take billions and billions of dollars to support terrorism forgets the fact that we know what Iran does when it has these billions. The sanctions that people are always looking to and saying, obviously, need to stay in place because they deprive Iran of billions and billions of dollars, are oil sanctions that were put in place in 2012. Prior to that, we've got a good case history of what Iran would do with that money. And most of it was going to development projects, albeit development projects that were heavily corrupted and a lot of money seemed to go where it was not intended to go. But it didn't go to terrorism. And that's because the Iranian government has interests beyond support for terrorism. But that doesn't also mean that the Iranian government would give up support for its foreign policy, which they believe is enhanced by engaging in acts in support for things that we judge to be terrorism. Again, it's a hard truth, but it's a real truth. And it's something that I think people need to keep in mind when they consider the merits of this deal. It's not a question of whether or not you like this deal. If you are opposed to Iran getting any sanctions relief because it may go to support terrorism, you are opposed to a deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's okay if that's your policy position. But candidly, I think you need to say that. And I think you need to express that that is your cause of concern, not the technicalities of this deal. I'd also note that there is nothing in the deal that precludes our ability to continue engaging in sanctions and continue using the tool of sanctions to put pressure on the Iranian government. In fact, the administration's been quite clear that that's its intention. The thing that will make those sanctions efforts work or fail to work is the context. If we were to decide to walk away from this deal now to pursue additional sanctions, we would have to explain that to the rest of the world. Right now, I think we'd fail, because a lot of people simply don't see the Iranian regional threat that we see, and certainly don't see it the same way. It's worth noting that the United States has said sanctions on Hezbollah since the mid-90s, and called it a foreign terrorist organization in 1997. The European Union only designated the military wing of Hezbollah in 2013. It's worth bearing in mind that some of our closest partners simply do not see the Middle East the way that we do, but we're dependent on them to make our sanctions work, and we're dependent on the narrative that we're able to describe to them to make them take those costs. I'd similarly note that the issue of snapback has come up, and a lot of people believe that snapback of sanctions is a completely feckless endeavor. I disagree. I think that you could have the snapback of sanctions triggered by Iranian breaches of the JCPOA, but it's going to depend on what those breaches are. Again, the context matters. If we were to choose to try and snap back sanctions for a valve being out of place at Natanz, we will fail. On the other hand, if we were to see some major Iranian violation, I'm quite confident that we can succeed. And I would just note a comment that the ambassador of France to the United States said on Twitter yesterday in response to criticism that Europe would never rejoin the pressure campaign. And he said, why? We did so in the first place. That's why we're here. And I think it's a false statement, and it's a false threat to suggest that European partners would not stand with us. Two additional points. I think our options to respond to any Iranian cheating, of course, are also not constrained, and that includes the use of military force. We have not given that up now, and we will not give that up going into the future. And I do believe that there is some chance that with economic integration, there is an opportunity for moderation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But I have not seen, and I do not believe anyone has elaborated, a plan that is wholly dependent on that possibility. Rather, I think it is a hope, it is an ambition, and we'll see whether or not it works. 3 quick points on implementation, and then I'll be quiet. First, I think as we move into the implementation phase, there are 3 potential crises that could come up, 2 of which we've got some control over. The first is that the Iranians could cheat, and they probably will. They will either cheat intentionally or accidentally. It's a highly technical document, and I guarantee there's an engineer someplace in Natanz who has not read it. and will not understand some of the technicalities there. And so there is the possibility for cheating, both inadvertently and intentionally. Our response to that is what's important, that we leap on any kind of violation that we detect as quickly as possible. And I think there's case history from the Joint Plan of Action and the period of 18 months we had that in place to demonstrate that we would. Second, that we goad the Iranians into breaking the terms of the deal by getting too aggressive with respect to sanctions authorities and trying to shove back into terrorism and other files the sanctions that have been given up as a result of this JCPOA. That does not mean, again, we can't do some additional sanctions and use the tools that we have, but we have to be conscious that the Iranians do have the ability to respond to that. That's not just called nuclear blackmail, that's simply a reality of a bargain we've reached. And the last point I would make is that we've got the possibility of the Iranians not getting the economic relief that they have promised themselves. And there is the possibility that in 5 years' time, a future Iranian government will sit around either with cause or without and say it was the Americans that stymied our ability to take advantage of this relief, and so we're walking away from the nuclear deal. That's a concern that we have to be aware of, not terrified of, but it's something we need to think about as we continue to enforce our sanctions and our very firm posture with respect to Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Stuart?
Okay, thank you. Thank you on the other side of the divide. There's a lot here to cover, obviously. They did a great job keeping it short. I'll do my best. We've already heard much about the agreement, mostly from the other side of the intellectual divide. And I don't necessarily disagree with many aspects of what the pro-agreement side has said. I agree that Iran was marching pretty quickly toward a nuclear bomb, which I believe is clearly its ultimate goal, at least a nuclear weapons capability, and that this agreement has most likely created something of a strategic pause along that path. I also agree that we're better off with international constraints on Iran's nuclear program, including outside inspections and high-tech monitoring of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, particularly its uranium enrichment facilities. But I'll predict for you today, Richard just kind of went into it, but I'll predict with full confidence that Iran will test the bounds of this agreement early and often, and that we're in for a major game of cat and mouse in coming weeks and months and years, more months and years. And I believe that all things equal, we're better off with more cats on the ground than the alternative. So there are some parts of this agreement that I agree with. I also agree that if military force is ultimately required to prevent Iran from going all in nuclear, we ought to first exhaust all diplomatic routes before resorting to force. Now, many proponents of this deal say this deal does just that it offers what John Kerry called Iran's, quote, last best chance, unquote, to avoid war by fully complying with an agreement that, according to President Obama, quote, permanently prohibits, unquote, Iran's ability to obtain a nuclear weapon. And that's where I begin to part company from the supporters of the agreement. The deal it struck was not a final bold stroke of coercive diplomacy that presented Iran with a clear and permanent choice between nuclear weapons or not. It's a deal that, at best, puts off that day of reckoning. And it puts off that day of reckoning based on what can only be understood as an enormous historical gamble. What the longtime New York Times foreign affairs reporter David Sanger calls, quote, President Obama's leap of faith on Iran, unquote. What Sanger says is a bet by this administration that by temporarily tamping down the Iranian nuclear issue, getting it off the front pages, Obama would, quote, have the time and space to restructure one of America's deepest adversarial relationships, unquote. The problem with all this, as I'm going to develop a little bit today, until Bob stops me, is that the deal puts off the day of reckoning, the day when we can honestly assess when this bet is paying off, to a time when Iran will, by simply abiding by this agreement, be much richer, much stronger in conventional military capability, much stronger in ballistic missile capability, and believe it or not, far more capable in nuclear capability than it is today. And I should also add, it will also possess a far greater capacity to protect and defend its nuclear facilities than it has today. That's all part of the agreement. Supporters of the deal, notably President Obama himself, are fond of repeating that opponents of the deal offer no alternative other than war. The choice is between, quote, this deal and some form of war, unquote, Obama said a few weeks ago. But there's another way to look at it. Not that this deal is the, quote, only alternative to war, but that this deal, the way it was negotiated, what it contains, the regional impact it's likely to have potentially increases rather than decreases the likelihood of military conflict. In other words, the question is not whether this is a good deal or a bad deal, but how we were left with this as the only deal. Take it or leave it, this or war. In order to unpack some of this stuff, I'm going to try to do two things. I'll do at least one thing. I'm going to try to do two things. But let me do at least one thing. The second thing we can maybe save for discussion. But first, I'd like to address a couple of the more potent arguments in favor of the agreement and expose some flaws in those arguments. And the second thing I'd like to do, which I might save a little for later, I'd like to get a little bit into the politics of the agreement here in the United States. Because with elections coming up, and the fact that this deal does not have the force of law of a treaty, means that America's role in this agreement is more tenuous than many may think. And that has a lot to do with, as Gary alluded to, the inconvenience of American democracy. But don't blame it on necessarily the Republicans, blame it on James Madison. So I'll get into that a little bit. I actually see some uncanny parallels to the League of Nations debate of 1919, where the US President Woodrow Wilson was the key architect and promoter of the League of Nations, won a Nobel Peace Prize for the League of Nations, then watched just about every country in the world join the League of Nations, except his own. In the United States, because he faced overwhelming opposition in Congress and from among the American people. And more ominously for the Democrats when it comes to this deal, and for the deal itself, the Republicans used the League of Nations as a hugely effective electoral wedge issue. The Democrats did not win another national election until 1932. It's not a perfect analogy. Other issues are always at play in national elections, but there are some creepy parallels. And if we have time, I'll go into some polling just came out yesterday, which should give some Democrats, including some folks I used to work with, some concern. But first, let me offer at least a quick rebuttal to what I think are the two most potent arguments in favor of the agreement. One having to do with the nature of the overall agreement itself, and one having to do with the issue of uranium enrichment, which is the cornerstone of the agreement. First, on the issue of the overall agreement. There's a strong argument by supporters of the agreement that this was the best possible deal, or close to it, considering it was with a country that had not been defeated militarily. Meaning, you can only truly disarm a country after it's been defeated in war. So the argument goes that the demands the United States started out with under both the Bush and Obama administrations, like dismantling its entire nuclear program, eliminating its ballistic missiles, stopping support of terrorism, as Richard mentioned, were unrealistic from the beginning of the negotiations. That all may be true. That unconditional surrender gives you the ultimate leverage. But that does not mean the United States used the considerable leverage it had at the start of the negotiations to attain a deal that could, for example, be supported by a simple majority in Congress. And as Richard knows, Congress has been very active in Iran policy and the sanctions policies for a decade. Consider for a moment where Iran was at the start of the secret negotiations in 2012. The Iranian regime just emerged from a major political crisis, the so-called Green Movement uprisings. Its economy was in tatters and sinking, due in large part to international economic sanctions, mostly US-led, but also including EU and UN multilateral sanctions, all imposed on Iran for its illicit nuclear program and violations of the UN Security Council resolutions, as well as some sanctions for its role as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. So the world was pretty well united against Iran's nuclear program. And in the region, Iran was facing historic adversaries, all vehemently opposed to Iran's nuclear program, countries who were also America's closest regional allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt. Iran, in short, was on the ropes, politically, economically, and diplomatically. And it was Iran that began sending out feelers that they were finally ready to negotiate an end to sanctions in return for major concessions on its nuclear program. In other words, the United States was in prime negotiating position. And the language out of the White House at the time, from what seemed like a position of strength and confidence, was that the United States was willing to trade, quote, the dismantlement of sanctions for the dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, unquote. That was the White House stated policy. Or as John Kerry said in 2013, quote, the goal of all of these international sanctions is for Iran to dismantle its nuclear program, unquote. Here's what President Obama said in late 2012, quote, the work that we've done with respect to sanctions now offers Iran a choice. They can take the diplomatic route and end their nuclear program, or they will have to face a united world and a United States president, me, who said we're not going to take any options off the table, unquote. Fast forward to today, and we're no longer discussing dismantling sanctions for dismantling Iran's nuclear program. Yes, the sanctions part gets dismantled. including what Obama last month called Iran's, quote, $150 billion in frozen assets parked outside the country, unquote. And of course, all other international trade and investment sanctions get lifted for Iran, potentially hundreds of billions more in economic windfall for a country, I might add, with a GDP of around 400 billion. So there's major economic rewards for Iran in this deal. Smart for them to do it, obviously. But far from dismantling its nuclear program, Iran keeps virtually its entire nuclear infrastructure. And while it is required to shut down its plutonium reactor at Arak, ARAK, as mentioned before, and mothball most of its uranium enrichment facilities, Iran is allowed to engage in extensive upgrades to its nuclear capabilities during the life of the agreement. Even President Obama acknowledged last spring that after 10 to 12 years, best case scenario, mind you, Iran will have, quote, an industrial scale program, unquote, with, quote, quoting the president, advanced centrifuges that enrich uranium fairly rapidly, and at that point the breakout times would have shrunk down almost to zero, unquote. After making these major concessions on uranium enrichment, the United States gave in on a whole bunch of other issues after that. First, its insistence on unfettered 24-hour, anytime, anywhere inspections of suspected nuclear sites, which has been reduced to, as mentioned before, a complex, more complex than described so far, 24-day review process. Then the United States dropped its insistence that Iran come clean on all of its past work on so-called military dimensions of its nuclear program, as required by terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That demand has been significantly watered down, and efforts to inspect and verify what Iran now says it has done in weaponization R&D at military sites like Parchin are now part of a complicated inspection agreement solely between the IAEA and Iran. Add to this last-minute concessions by the United States that allow the lifting of international bans on Iranian imports of sophisticated conventional weapons and ballistic missile technology during the life of the agreement. So yes, Iran had not been defeated in war, so we should not have expected anything close to full disarmament, but we also should not have expected a deal tilted so egregiously in its favor. Now, obviously I'm not advocating war, and people who know me, there's students of mine here, and a lot of colleagues I've worked with for a long time. I've never been someone beating the drum for military action against Iran. But I do think that the biggest mistake of the administration was essentially removing any realistic sense of use of force from the landscape of these negotiations. There was never any credible threat against Iran if it refused to accept the strictest possible terms for an agreement, never tested. Now, we shouldn't bandy about use of force lightly, so I'm not going to do that today, but I'm bringing it up because whether we like it or not, force and use of force has always been lurking around issues of nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation because it is a vital, if not the most vital, international security issue, including the quote from Obama I gave you from 2012, all options on the table is diplo-political speak for military options. So the use of force is part of the discussion of nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation. And as we know, there are countries in the region who will not hesitate to use force against its neighbors if they seem like they're developing weapons, including Israel. It's done it with the help of some of the Sunni Arab countries along the way. And by way of context, it certainly did not help that right smack in the middle of the most critical parts of the negotiations between the US and Iran, that was in the summer of 2013, Obama famously backed down on his publicly stated threat to launch military strikes against the Assad regime in Syria for its use of chemical weapons against its civilians, something the whole region closely watched, not least of all Iran, the patron state of the Assad regime. I'll take this even one step further. Forget military force. The Obama White House was even pushing back on tighter economic sanctions that were passed in Congress in huge bipartisan majorities. In 2011, 2012, and 2013, both parties in Congress, by overwhelming majorities, thought it was time to tighten the screws economically. This administration thought it was time to offer concessions. And that's why Congress, including many, if not most Democrats, were wary of the administration policy on Iran and only recently came in line more for political, in many ways, than policy reasons. If you don't like me bringing up use of force, you better get used to it. And not from me or Danny or the Republicans or Dick Cheney or, well, maybe Danny, but from the Democrats. They're now all tripping over themselves to issue military threats against Iran. Saying that if they violate any parts of the agreement, they're going to be met with immediate military retaliation. Go take a look at Hillary Clinton's speech from yesterday. It was an attempt at a course correction in a lot of ways of the Obama negotiations, which she was part of for a big chunk of her time as Secretary of State. She said it was not enough to have force as just an option on the table. She said the United States has to make it perfectly clear U.S. will, quote, not hesitate to take military action the moment Iran breaks its agreements preventing it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. She told reporters before the speech she wants the United States to have a new declaratory policy, that the United States will virtually immediately use force if Iran breaks parts of the agreement. And it's not just Hillary Clinton. Check out what Democratic members of Congress are saying about the deal, and I'm not talking about the ones who opposed the deal, like Chuck Schumer and Bob Menendez and Ben Cardin and Ted Deutsch and Steve Israel in the House. I'm talking about the Democrats who support the deal. Go read what they say. The best argument against the deal to me is what some of these Democratic supporters put out statements after they voted in favor. They all now sound like Dr. Strangelove. They're all threatening military response, and now it's serious. Iran cannot do this, or we're going to start attacking them. The time to have used those threats and that leverage was before the negotiations or during the negotiations, not after the negotiations. Frederick the Great, I'll finish on this because I'll quote Frederick the Great to conclude. Frederick the Great once said, "Diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments." Not arms to invade Iran, but arms as a credible tool of statecraft. We missed that in this deal, and now everyone is trying to play catch up. But in many ways, it's too late. Final point, because this relates to how I opened. Oh, yeah, I know. But, okay, there's a prior case in Libya where a country disarmed without active force because they were concerned about a credible threat of force. But that's the Libya case from '03. We can jump into it if we have some time. If anyone wants to talk more about the politics and the polls and what's going to happen in Congress, we can do that in some of the discussion.
First of all, thank you. I think I'm the only non-Columbia person at the table, so I'm delighted to have been invited to join this panel. I don't know what Stuart would have done by himself, but he certainly would have been outnumbered on the ideological side. Okay, wait, let me hit start. So, let me try and outline a little bit, with hopefully not too much repetition of the arguments that have been made already. But in any case, I really do look forward to a conversation, because I think there actually is an intelligent conversation to be had about this deal. One of the things that disappoints me the most when I hear people debating this is people who suggest, no, this deal is really the epitome of evil on earth today. Or the people who say, no, this is really a good deal. Because the truth is, most proponents who are honest don't think this is a good deal. They just think it was the best deal the president could have gotten in the circumstances. Okay, I can accept that formulation. I disagree with it. I don't think this is the worst deal on the face of the earth that's going to precipitate nuclear war. On the other hand, I don't think it's a very good deal. But let me outline for a second what's wrong with my side. And a couple of people have alluded to this, but I don't think that, frankly, those of us who are opposed to this deal have done a good enough job of introspection. And the first thing is that there have been an enormous number of not terribly potent arguments against it. Number one, this is a treaty. This should have been submitted to the Senate. This is unprecedented. This is a violation of the Constitution, yet another predation on the Constitution by the president. You know what? Actually, that's not true. Okay. Yes, I think that a deal of this moment should appropriately have been treated as a treaty by the executive, but the truth is, that choice is the president's and the president's alone, no matter who the president is. The Constitution makes pretty clear you can choose, and guess what? Getting 67 votes, as opponents of this deal have discovered, is pretty damn hard. So since the 1950s, we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of executive agreements and very few treaties. So that's sort of a point that I think has been a distraction, not terribly effective. Ditto for the unconstitutional argument. Then there's the argument that actually popped up just yesterday when a couple of members said that Republican members who opposed the deal said that they were going to step up. Ted Cruz was one of them, and there was Pete Roscoe in the House, and they said that the agreement was not properly submitted to the Congress, that the side agreements hadn't been submitted to the Congress, and therefore the 60-day clock did not start ticking. Now, I hate to tell them, I'm only telling you, but I did try and tell them, this is not how reality works. The reality is that the clock started ticking. Now, were there side agreements? There were. Should the Obama administration have had a more honest approach to this? for sure. What they should have done is gone to the Congress and said, there are side agreements here. We cannot share them with you for X, Y, and Z reason. And they could have had a back and forth. But instead, it was sort of the usual, drop dead, try and make me kind of a discussion with, people like Ben Rhodes coming out and calling everybody who disagrees with him an idiot or a liar. These are not smart ways to have a discussion, and I think on our side in particular, it reminds me of that scene in Blazing Saddles, if you know what I'm talking about. Right. I'm glad to hear somebody laughed. My kids have no idea what I'm talking about. I also think that, that another weakness, a strong weakness here, is that we knew what Obama was about. He didn't lie. He ran on a platform of an outstretched hand to Iran. And we elected him. I didn't vote for him, but the country did, and that's the way the country works. So, all of these sorts of things and all of this outrage that I think is associated with this has not been terribly effective. And I think my side in particular needs to look at that and understand. I also think that there were some strategic mistakes, which actually have been alluded to, but I want to sort of double down on them. From the time that I began working on this issue, which I am scared to say was in the mid-1980s, so maybe a little bit later than some of the folks at this table, we've been talking about Iran's time to a bomb. Okay? And I, at a certain point, a couple years ago, went through and made a list of all of the warnings that Iran was 10 years away. The first one I got was 10 to 20 years away. And then we got down to 3 to 5 years, 6 months, blah, 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 all of these things. And how does that frame the argument? The way it frames the argument very simply is that Iran is racing towards a bomb. Okay, if you want to respond to Iran racing towards a bomb, this isn't a bad deal. Okay, now, that's the problem. We, many of us, set ourselves up because this rhetorical construct became a trap into which everybody fell, which is, what if Iran is not racing towards a bomb? What if Iran wants a substantial, robust breakout capacity with an arsenal of nuclear weapons? Then, by the way, this is an awesome deal for them. But the sort of 6-month timeline, the Bibi Netanyahu standing up before the United Nations with that cartoonish ticking bomb, these all played into the hands of those who wanted to make a deal that stopped Iran from breaking out tomorrow. And of course, Iran chose. They don't want to be North Korea. They kind of want to be like Japan. Okay, that needed to be responded to. But all of this said, even proponents, as I said at the outset, really do admit that this is not a great agreement. They simply suggest it's the best they can get. But they've also suggested, as Stuart alluded to, that opponents don't really have any ideas. And the answer to that is that's absolutely untrue. There really have been very serious, very credible arguments made throughout the process, not just ex post facto after the deal was signed, but throughout the process of negotiations. So, the president himself and his aides, Wendy Sherman, who's his chief negotiator, outlined what the parameters of a better deal should have looked like. Wendy said in 2013, any deal would require, what you said, a lot of dismantling, quote unquote, of nuclear infrastructure. John Kerry said it. But there's not a lot of dismantling going on. There's some mothballing, but there's not a lot of dismantling of Iran's basic infrastructure. In 2013, Kerry said that Iran has no right to enrichment. Now, for non-proliferation people, as opposed to regional people, this is really important because the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is not very precise on this question, but it does definitely not grant a right to enrichment. And the position going in was the right position of the administration, which is there's no right to enrichment. The Iranians are coming out of this with a right to enrich. In 2013, Kerry said, from our point of view, Arak is unacceptable. Arak is the heavy water reactor that somebody referred to earlier. Arak is now being redesigned so that it doesn't produce weapons-grade plutonium in normal operations, but it is not being scrapped, and there is no prohibition on returning it to heavy water reactors after 15 years. In 2013, the president said, we know that they don't need to have an underground fortified facility like Fordow, which is one of the enrichment facilities that the Iranians built, in order to have a peaceful nuclear program. But now Fordow is being converted into a, quote, nuclear physics and technology center. I think that's actually what Fordow was before. All restrictions are gone in 15 years. on what are called the PMD, because we have an acronym for everything in Washington, the past military dimensions, or the probable, military dimensions of Iran's program. In 2014, Wendy Sherman said, quote, "We have required that Iran come clean on its past actions as part of any comprehensive agreement." In 2015, Kerry said they have to do it in reference to that. Now the administration insists that possible military dimensions of the program are irrelevant and that all of Iran's past activities are known. I hate to tell you, but every single one of Iran's past activities came as a complete surprise to our intelligence community. Yes, and I had a security clearance, so trust me.
Well,
Trust me. And by the way, you're the moderator.
but I have the last word.
We'll see about that. I'm the woman. Ballistic missile restrictions. This is an interesting issue. Ballistic missile restrictions are gone in 8 years. This wasn't even something that was part of the discussion at the beginning. Suddenly it pops up at the end. Ballistic missile restrictions are gone in 8 years. But the Iranians have said that they have no intention of keeping to the ballistic missile restrictions in any way. They're not contained in the JCPOA. They are in the UN Security Council resolution. And Rouhani has come out and said directly, we do not view that as binding on us. And not only that, but we do not view a violation of the Security Council as a violation of the JCPOA, which would render all of its terms moot. On inspections. We've talked about this, the anywhere, anytime. We're not getting anywhere, anytime. But we're not really even getting close to anywhere, anytime. Even the 24-day timeline, which we're being told, no, it's totally fine. Really it is. It's just, they won't be able to do anything. They can't hide anything. We have such good visibility into the Iranian program, it won't matter what they use the 24 days for. Okay, A, that's not true. B, it is not just 24 days. There are a whole series of terms in that section of the JCPOA which are completely unclear. Snapback, that's 35 days. This, I think, is the biggest piece of, excuse my directness, BS in this entire discussion. Not because the mechanism of snapback isn't there, but because that's not how sanctions work. Anybody who says, like Gérard Araud, the French ambassador, who does not in many ways represent the real views of his government on this question, said that, we were part of the sanctions process. I don't know whether people remember how difficult it was to get the Europeans to sign up to Iran sanctions. It was bloody impossible. And we had sanctions in place on the Iranians for years before the Europeans became part of it. And even then, even as the Europeans put sanctions on the Iranians, they pressed back and tried to keep going with business deals and sales and all the rest of it. So the notion that somehow the Europeans are a stalwart in this and that they will stand with us against this committee that includes Iran, Russia, and China seems to me to be not credible. Just a couple last points. My phone went off. Excuse me, guys. Let me see.
You've got 3 more minutes.
I've got 3 more minutes. If I end early, I'm going to sing for you. It's going to be beautiful. So, a few other points I want to make. I think that there are some unintended consequences of this deal that haven't gotten enough discussion, and I think they deserve it no matter where you stand, and I encourage you to ask us about it. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. From my standpoint, it's a dead letter. Okay? And I think that that is a huge shame. Now, was the NPT perfect? No. No international agreement, as we keep hearing from proponents of the deal, is perfect. But over the last 40-plus years, the international community really has agreed to abide by the rules of the game roughly laid out in the NPT and subsequently in the additional protocol. The bottom line for what this deal does, to my mind, is it suggests that you can use the NPT, you can violate your safeguards obligations under the NPT, and you will not at the end pay a price. To the contrary, what you will do is, with some small concessions, you will be right back where you started again. I think this sends a lesson to everybody in the region, and I think it's an important one, and I think it is worthy of discussion. And it probably, by the way, was worthy of discussion even before the JCPOA because it has been eroding for a long time. And nobody, not even proponents of this deal, want to see a nuclear cascade in the region or globally. Then there's another problem. So the United States negotiates nuclear cooperation agreements with a whole variety of countries, as I'm sure you all are aware. We negotiated one with the United Arab Emirates. These are called 123 agreements based on the provision of law, and we negotiated a deal with the United Arab Emirates according to what the Obama administration nicely calls the gold standard. Okay? What is the gold standard? No enrichment, no reprocessing. Oh, wait a minute. The Iranians are allowed to enrich. The Iranians are allowed to reprocess. Why are the Emiratis not allowed to enrich and reprocess? What about the Saudis? Again, a question that deserves some discussion and certainly is getting discussed rather vociferously in the region. Then there's the response of the administration to this deal. So we call everybody in, come, King of Saudi Arabia, come, Amir, come, all of my friends, come Israel. We know you're very worried about this deal. Why don't we sell you a really, really large amount of weapons in response? Okay, why is this a good deal if the required response is that we need to make billions and billions of dollars in arms sales and escalate the quality and quantity of weapons that we are providing to the Middle East? Why is this a moment of peace in our time? I don't quite get that. And by the way, I also don't get the notion that this diminishes the likelihood of conflict when we're arming everybody to the teeth. Okay, just a sort of a little contradiction to talk about. I also think that it's important that we talk about the covert path. Everything that gets talked about in the JCPOA, this blocks all paths for Iran to a nuclear weapon. This is being sort of repeated, was repeated yesterday by Hillary Clinton, as if it is one of the 10 commandments. Okay, what if Iran has a covert program? Oh, well, the DCI and the DNI will tell us, oh, no, they don't, because we know everything they're doing. Yesterday or the day before, the DCI said we have secret extra special means of finding out. I'm sorry, life is not a James Bond movie. We may have secret extra special means of finding out, but that would not negate the fact that Natanz, that Fordow, that India's nuclear detonation, that that North Korea's nuclear detonations, all of these came as a shock. Not instantaneously, but certainly as quite a shock to the intelligence community. The other thing that hasn't been talked about is the foreign path. Okay? The Iranians cooperate with the North Koreans and the Syrians on nuclear weapons activity. We know that to be true. Okay? Iran has a senior nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was in North Korea for their last nuclear test. Now, maybe he was just there for the sun. Could be, I'm not aware of the tourism advantages of North Korea, but maybe that was it. This deal does nothing. Nothing. And in fact, it does not even suggest that such work might be a violation of the underlying JCPOA. That's a huge problem. Now I'm close to my end of time, but I want to just make some positive recommendations. A lot of us have spent a lot of time talking about how the deal sucks. It does. What went wrong? We do. What should we do next is not out there enough, and so let me end with that. This is going down on the Hill. There'll either be a filibuster. Frankly, I think that is a very bad strategic choice for some of the reasons Stuart laid out. I also think it's a bad strategic choice for the White House. The White House should not be in the business, particularly when it's about to win on something, of trying to stuff things down the throats of the representatives of the American people. I've written that this has the potential to be like the Obamacare of foreign policy. And what I mean by that is not that it's a piece of crap that everybody ought to have opposed in the beginning, although I think that as well, but that this is the I'm making up a word now, partisanization of foreign policy in ways that I think are bad for the White House, especially because they're going to win. I think they could have handled this a lot differently, and I think that the filibuster is a huge mistake. I think that what the Congress needs to do is that the White House says this is our interpretation of the Iran deal. As all of you know, the Iranians have a totally different interpretation of the Iran deal. That being said, what we ought to do is enshrine what the interpretation of the White House is in law, so that when they want to lift the sanctions they say they're not going to lift, they won't be able to. I also think that we need to actually embrace a strategy, as Mrs. Clinton tried to lay out yesterday, that is more than just words on deterrence and to limit Iran's other activities. Because one of the most important things that this deal does for the Iranians is not that it gives them the ability to nuke Israel tomorrow, which I don't believe they want to do, or to nuke Saudi Arabia next week. I don't think that that's in their aim, notwithstanding what the Supreme Leader said yesterday about Israel not existing in 25 years. Their aim is to have uncontested dominance of the region. Okay? And it is our job to start pushing back on that. And it is our job to deal with the challenge that we now have, which is that at every moment we will have to calculate, is this violation worth rendering the JCPOA null and void? Is that violation? What about arming Hezbollah? Is that worth it? Worth escalating with the Iranians? What about arming Hamas? What about what you're doing in Syria? Our job now is to prove that we're not going to be self-limiting because of the JCPOA, and figuring that out and having Congress empower the president, but more importantly, the next president to do that, I think is a very important next step. Thank you for letting me go over and for listening to me and letting me swear, because I do that too often.
Oh, we invite our guests to swear.
But not at each other.
No, that's right. All right, in a great measure of restraint, I will hold, I may make some remarks at the end, but let me open it up for questions and responses from the panel. If you'd line up at that microphone, please, if you would just give your name and then the question stated succinctly.
I'm the Director of Communications for the American Iranian Council. It's a think tank that's been engaged in U.S.-Iran relations. I do have a specific question, particularly for Mr. Nephew, but just very quickly, I want to clarify something, because in the context of Mrs. Pletka's very robust and astute testimony, you stated that the JCPOA sets a precedent whereby NPT signatories have the right to enrichment and reprocessing. I think you're certainly right on enrichment, but on reprocessing...
No, it's a comment. Just give your question. Don't set a bad precedent.
Okay, all right, fine. I hope that other panels will bring this point up.
But come and yell at me about it afterwards.
Okay, all right, sure. The question for Mr. Nephew, I want to zero in on the efficacy of sanctions and really determine, was it sanctions that achieved compliance in this latest round? Because I'll very briefly add a comment here to respond to, which is just that I think the major shift that took place was that the United States moved from a position of demanding zero enrichment to limited enrichment, and that's what made the last round more successful, alongside with the election of Hassan Rouhani, which kind of changed the optics because it would have been so difficult to engage with the Ahmadinejad administration. And if you look at the correlation between sanctions increasing, they're correlated with an increase in centrifuges rather than a decrease. Thank you.
No, I think that's right to some extent. What I would say is really two things. One, I think we were always going to enter a game of each building up our own leverage for entering negotiations, right? From the Iranian perspective, that was increasing centrifuges. From our perspective, it was increasing sanctions. I do think that sanctions pressure gave the impetus for the Iranians to accept restrictions that they weren't otherwise prepared to accept. And that made the negotiation position easier for us to deal with. I do think that fundamentally, though, there would have been no deal had we insisted on there being no nuclear program in Iran or no enrichment in Iran. And I think that the Iranian rhetoric on this, the Iranian positions on this going back 15 years, demonstrate that they were not prepared to accept the absence of a nuclear program or absence of enrichment. And to one quick addition on the NPT question that comes up, I think it's worth noting that the NPT is silent on the issue of whether or not enrichment is a right or not. The United States position has been and remains that enrichment is not an automatic right of the NPT, and there are nuclear programs that exist without it. But the fact of the matter is we are very lonely in that position, and we only have so much ability to push that position onto others. When we try to, for instance, preclude nuclear cooperation if it involved enrichment or reprocessing activities involved in any country, we couldn't get the Nuclear Suppliers Group to agree to it or the NPT Review Conference to agree to it, and that was under President Bush in a very robust approach to foreign policy. So the upshot is, even though that may be our view, that does not mean we can tell everybody else how it's going to be.
Next question. Then I have to do.
If Iran, in 10 years or so, goes for the bomb, what should or could the United States do, since a military attack against Iran is out of the question, because it would be a disaster to the United States' national interest in foreign policy, and in security too.
How do you want to handle it?
Want me to take?
Yeah, Gary, and then I'll make
I think that we have some experience with that. We have, in fact, been facing that problem with Iran for the last 15 years. Actually, for the last 25 or 30 years, if you want to look at it that way. And if you believe people who were warning of Iran's nuclear capability starting back in the early 90s, we have been aware of the problem, and I don't see why we can't declare success. That basically for all of that period of time with Iran rushing to a bomb, they didn't get it. And they're done, and they've now signed an agreement that precludes doing that for the foreseeable future. And it's not just that at the end of 10 years they can just go ahead and build a bomb. That just isn't true at all. And no country that's ever accepted the additional protocols of the IAEA have ever tried to build a nuclear weapon. So, I don't think we've lost all leverage, and I don't think we've lost all capability, and I think the effort to focus exclusively on differences of opinion and things that may be weaknesses of the agreement and overlook the grand scope of the thing, which in fact prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which was the idea. It was not to keep Iran from funding Hezbollah. It was not to solve the Syrian problem. It was to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And I would argue that is a very successful operation, and I think we have every reason to be proud of it.
My name is Alex McCoy. I'm on the board of Columbia's Military Veterans Organization, and my question is, a number of the Republican candidates for president have stated that they would, on day one of their administration, tear up the agreement. Is this possible, or is this just a rhetorical statement of their opposition to the deal? And if so, what could a Republican president in 2016 do to modify this agreement, and what impact would those options have on the other partners to the agreement, particularly the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, and Iran itself?
Yeah, it's a very important question. Gary wants to start, and I'll see if someone else wants to.
Gary's a Republican?
What?
Gary's a Republican? Damn. You're not kidding.
Okay.
Way undercover.
I actually have a little experience with this idea of tearing up the text on the first day. I was very much part of the group that negotiated with Iran 36 years ago when we were, the last time we ever had a negotiation with Iran, which resulted in the Algiers Accord that released the American hostages. And that was a very controversial thing. And at that time, it was signed just before the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Reagan, as President-elect Reagan, said this agreement was done under coercion, it was forced upon us, and we do not need to obey. We don't have to actually do this. Then he became President Reagan. And he looked at the agreement, and he looked at the fine print of what actually the United States got out of it. He discovered that the American banks would have suffered greatly if we didn't do this, that a lot of other people who actually had claims against Iran would never get their claims settled. It would undo a whole series of structures that were there in existence that actually, and then it would also make people say, okay, can you ever trust Reagan for anything that he does? He can't keep the word of the United States government. People who become president have a different perspective on things. What happened was Reagan got into office. Very quietly, he said, well, maybe not. And he accepted it, and that agreement, whether you like it or not, has been the law of the land ever since that time. So I think the idea that a president is going to come in and tear it up, that's not impossible, but there are huge costs associated with that. And my guess is whoever becomes president will look very, very seriously at that before they do it.
May I?
Yeah.
It's a good question. There you are. It's a good question. While I agree, surprise, with Gary Sick, that your position as a candidate and your position as president are very different, I think that there's also something else to understand here, which is something bad, a systemic problem, and it's the one that I alluded to when I talked about Obamacare. When you pursue agreements of this kind, when you seek to articulate your power through executive authority, whether it is in domestic or in foreign policy, you run the risk that your deeds will be undone. And that is not how America has been seen over the years. We are not We are not some third world country that just sort of changes with the vagaries of our election process and previous agreements are just ripped up. But increasingly, because of the growing power of the presidency and of the executive, we are becoming like that. And that's one of the reasons why, again, I think that it was so corrosive and unnecessary to try to pursue the congressional desire for input in this nasty, partisan way, because it pushes people to saying those things. I don't think that there's any chance. I don't think any Republican president can rip up this agreement, because the consequences of ripping it up have been constructed in such an artful way that it will redound finally to the discredit of the United States should we do it. Now, does that mean that that Republican presidents will therefore also ignore the violations that the Iranians have been engaging in during and since the beginning of discussions? No, I don't think a Republican president will be as willing to look away. But that being said, again, the construction of this deal, which is incredibly advantageous to the Iranians, is that at every stage they will have to ask themselves, is it worth walking away from this larger good in order to nip the Iranian actions in the bud on this, or this? And that's the challenge that we all face.
I'm going to make one, I hope, nonpartisan comment. I think that this brings up, and a lot of things we've said, and I know from my former students who were in the government working on this, is how do you create a gradation of American reactions, preferably with European agreement, to fit a gradation of possible Iranian cheating? And we've faced a number of problems. First, my guess is the extent of the cheating, and it's a crude term, but I'll use it in lack of a better one, is going to be unclear, something we can debate. And second, it's not likely to be enormous. I mean, if we could imagine the outer limits. And the Iranians have been crude in a number of ways, done a number of things that are very self-defeating for them. A good chance, they might do something like that. But let's assume that isn't the case. I think no matter who the new president is, or even in the last year of the Obama administration, that's the challenge. And it is hard. Not insurmountable, but I think that is the challenge anyone will face.
Hi there.
Just
My name's
a quick thing.
Bob,
Bob, do you think that the fact that if it became so partisan that there's sort of a leverage Republicans will have by saying this wasn't our agreement, so we're going to have a little bit more credibility and a little bit more validity, that they would be more willing to walk away from an agreement if Iran was sort of going up the escalation ladder of cheating?
They might have more credibility with Iran. They might have a harder time with some of the allies, unlike France, because France has been tougher for a variety, because they dealt with the Iranians more than we have. They've been much more.
But I mean, what you lay out is a very important challenge, which is, the meaning of is. What the term of art here for snapback is, quote, significant non-performance.
Yeah,
we can argue till the cows come home about what does that mean?
Yeah.
But actually, Professor, if I can, I mean, I think it's true that there can be a debate, but let's look very carefully at the dispute resolution process that's actually laid out in the text. And it gives any one country the ability to say, we don't think that the dispute that we've brought to the table has been resolved, and if not, to bring it to the Security Council for a resolution that's termed, do we keep the sanctions suspended or not? Which gives us the ability to veto it and to bring the sanctions back into effect. The question really is how long that process can go on. But the dates that are defined in the text suggest that it could be between 60 and 80 days. Well, I can already see people saying, well, 80 days, that's a lot of time to break out. Does anyone actually think that if we got word that the Iranians are screwing the last screw into a warhead, we're going to go back to the Council in any event for a sanctions snapback? The answer is no. So the issue of gradations is quite important, but I think the dispute process actually gives us the ability to deal with those on a gradated basis. And we give you a very quick example. In December of 2013, the IR-8 centrifuge was found to be in the Natanz pilot plant. It was something that the United States government did not believe was consistent with the joint plan of action. Our response to that was to go to the Iranians and say it has to be stopped. You may not start that centrifuge. You may not feed it with uranium. It is not part of the research and development program that we agreed to under the joint plan of action. What happened? The Iranians disconnected it from all its pipes. They didn't feed uranium through it, and it stayed there as a dud throughout the entire joint plan of action. We didn't need to tear up the document. We didn't need to go to a global snapback in order to achieve our objective in that respect.
Because I'm going to disagree a little, so being the moderator,
There you go.
that I think at all, the first stage was certainly further discussions with Iran, and I'm not totally as, I think there are possibility of real compliance here. That is, there could be things where we call them on it and they would say, okay, and step back as they did. But if that doesn't happen, the next stage is politics, right? I mean, I think that the snapback provisions are written really ingeniously, and I talked to some of my friends as something's going on. I did not, I was very impressed, but it was more ingenious than many of us had expected. Nevertheless, when it comes to what is significant and what does the evidence mean, it's going to be discussions, with our allies.
New
on this.
negotiation. That's what
And
happened
that's,
with North Korea.
that's the fact of life. On the other hand, the more blatant Iran does anything, certainly the much greater chance they have of the snapback.
Could we just be clear here? If we're talking about lab work at the margins of what's going on, that they're doing a little lab work of some sort that looks like it could be used for the design, for instance, of a nuclear warhead or something like that. Do you throw out the whole agreement because of that?
QED.
Do they get a nuclear weapon?
Right.
Look, the objective here, and I think we need to have enforcement mechanisms. We need to have an idea of what we mean. But I think to say that any diversion whatsoever, anything that you don't like, is grounds for throwing the whole thing out is really pretty silly. And if you're
And
really
this is the
looking
problem with the
at
deal.
Iran getting a nuclear weapon, they don't do it in 24 days or 60 days. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of activity that is detectable. And I think we have to be sensible about this.
We could go on, and I'd like to, but I am going to go to the next.
Yeah, I apologize. I started this whole thing. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. My name is Hunter Stiers. I'm an undergraduate at Columbia. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. This was fascinating. Ms. Pletka alluded to this in her, would we say, discussion, testimony, I suppose, that very little of the debate surrounding should we accept the nuclear deal has centered on what would happen afterwards and kind of the day after scenario. And would this actually, I suppose, after walking away from the agreement or after Iran cheats on the agreement, what would happen afterwards? So that's sort of the question that I'd like to pose to the panel, sort of bifurcated along Dr. Jervis's buffer zone. For Professor Sick and Professor Nephew, what do you think is the best way forward in terms of after Iran would hypothetically cheat on the deal down the road? And then for Ms. Pletka and Professor Gottlieb, what is our best plan of action if we decide that abandoning the deal is, and how would, therefore, in comparison, which would better advance our national interest?
We've, I think, covered a little of this, so I'll ask the panelists to be very brief.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, again, I don't think that the JCPOA precludes any of our options. It puts it all back in the issue of context. For us to decide that a valve out of place is reason enough to declare war, launch the bombers, et cetera, is a ridiculous idea. And if that were to be the case, then I'd like to ask why in 2003 we didn't do that, in 2007 we didn't do that, when in fact we found out about Fordo. And I would note, by the way, that was not a surprise to the U.S. intelligence community. It was known well before the rest of the world happened to know.
Yes,
But the upshot is that we will have the ability to respond, including using force and additional sanctions, in the event of any future Iranian cheating. None of that has been precluded. It's all about the context.
Yeah, I'll say from the other part of the question, you know, if the deal falls through, what happens? You know, I mean, this deal is being held up almost like the Magna Carta. You know, and that's what happens when you present a deal that, you know, it's either this or nuclear war and all-out, you know, conflict. I just think that that's ridiculous. You know, I think we've come to a point, life and international relations would go on in absence of this deal if it breaks through for any whole host of reasons. And foreign policy gets reconfigured. There's allies in the regions. We're already talking about strengthening alliances with some of Iran's neighbors and a whole variety of things. But I wouldn't jump the gun. I mean, this deal has gone through, as Danny has said, and we're going to see how it plays out.
Just a really short note. Daniel Patrick Moynihan coined a wonderful phrase about defining deviancy down. And this is the problem, okay? It is that 20 years ago, we would have been appalled at the very notion that any country like North Korea would detonate a nuclear weapon. And the last time they were about to test, I can't remember who it was exactly. It was either it may have been Mrs. Clinton who referred to it this way, but as a cry for help. You know, petulant children misbehaving. Okay, now just think about, it was during the Obama administration. Think about this trajectory and then understand why people who are concerned about this look at the trajectory with Iran. The problem is, of course, a bolt loose, a lab test aside, is not a reason to walk away from an agreement. The question just becomes, what is that reason?
And can I say, and are there things you do, what are things you do short of walking away from the agreement that are to a proportion of responses and that?
Well, this is what they're doing in legislation now. I mean, this is what the Democrats are trying to do. They're trying to put in a whole host, Richard Haas wrote a piece about this, you know, put in a whole host of new laws, new provisions, new things that don't directly affect the deal itself, but are going to become part, supposedly, of American policy, which is all opposed by the White House, but supported by Hillary Clinton, apparently, as of the speech yesterday. So we might be heading in that direction, but that might not play well with allies. It probably won't play well with Iran. I mean, this is all, we're in an experiment that's going to be playing out now for the next couple of months and years before we even know what's going to happen.
Yeah, next question.
Thanks very much.
And then I'm going to interject a question.
Hi, my name is Elijah Diamond. I'm a student at Yeshiva University, so I came downtown. By the way, thank you guys so much for coming. I think that one of the things that we overlook in this deal, perhaps, is the dichotomy that's been offered between trust and verification. That language is borrowed from the Reagan administration during its arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. I think that a really important element to contrast verification to, if you're going to say that this deal has legitimate verification protocols, is enforcement. Verification is only effective if you have enforcement. I would like to bring up two concerns I have after having read the agreement with enforcement. You mentioned that in terms of sanctions snapback, that there's a bureaucratic process by which we can then reimpose sanctions, but those sanctions can only be applied, according to the agreement, on contracts that were not entered into. Because of a grandfather clause that exists under the agreement, any contract that is stipulated prior to that sanction being reimposed cannot be affected by sanctions. So I think that is troubling, and that incentivizes the international community.
One question, make the other, because you...
Okay, yeah, sorry. And I think that the agreement actually does limit our ability to take military action against Iran. According to the agreement, the international community has promised to help Iran and assist Iran in defending its nuclear program against technological warfare, and we will have inspectors on the ground in Iran. So I believe that if we want to make a shock and awe military attack on Iran, if we see them rushing to a bomb, we won't be able to do that because we will have people on the ground.
Okay, yeah. Richard?
So if I could take the issue of grandfathering, unfortunately, I think you're not reading the text properly in the context of the way U.S. sanctions work. There is no grandfather for ongoing projects after snapback. What there is a promise that we will not retroactively impose sanctions for facilities and plants and activities that took place while the deal was legal. It's basically the concept of we're not going to drop the hammer on you, oil company, for having built a rig, but if you continue with those activities thereafter, we can. And that's what's meant, and as I understand it, Jack Lew has been very explicit about the extent of grandfathering, which in fact would not protect those kinds of activities. One last comment, Joe, on the issue of military action and assisting them with nuclear security activities. The concept of nuclear security is dealing with issues of terrorism, and it's ensuring physical protection of facilities against terrorist activities and terrorist threats. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been engaged in those activities with Iran throughout all of this process. And it's something that the United States, and it's a bipartisan effort, has thought is quite important to avoid terrorists getting access to nuclear materials and detonating bombs, dirty bombs, so on and so forth. That is what is intended to be covered by this. And these ideas that somehow the European Union is going to be required to defend Iran against Israel is I'm sorry, just spin. And it's simply not accurate, not included in the text of the deal.
Since we're running out of time, I'm going to ask the remaining questioners to all of them to ask their questions. I'm going to add one, and then we'll allow the panel members both to respond to those and to make any concluding remarks.
Thank you. I'm Jacqueline Burns. I'm a CEPA student. This question is mostly for Mr. Nephew. I was hoping you could explain, for those who may call for a better deal, one that includes missiles, PMD, and perhaps more stringent enrichment restrictions, on why you're confident that you reached an absolute red line with Iran's negotiators, when the Supreme Leader is currently touting this as a victory, and whereas in the past Khomeini characterized the Iraq-Iran agreement as drinking from the poisoned chalice. Right. Thank you.
Sure, I would say a couple of things.
Let me have all the questions and then.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Fabio Perrier, and I'm an executive MPA student here at CEPA. I guess my question is related to the recent, Iran recently basically gave up the Khobar Towers terrorists who, if you're not familiar, blew up a bunch of U.S. Air Force people. They more or less gave them up. And I just wondered if this is a good sign or a bad sign in terms of where we go, how we go forward, and whether you would comment on sort of all of the, I mean, if anyone wanted to bring up all of the good things that happened during these last couple of years of negotiations where there was cooperation, do you think that portends well for the future? Leading question, I know, but.
Let me ask a question that I want, mostly for Gary, who knows Iran better, at least than I do. Is there any chance that Iran might reject the agreement? It has to be voted on, and the Supreme Leader's remarks have been somewhat open-ended. So with that, let's go through the panel, and starting with Richard, I'm actually going to make a couple of remarks on that, and then we'll go in reverse order, or the order we're sitting here, which will give Stuart the last word.
Okay, so to address the question about ballistic missiles and conventional arms and PMD, I would first note, I think it's a misnomer that all restrictions on Iranian ballistic missile activities are going away. First off, in the terms of the deal, those restrictions will remain in place at a UN level for 8 years. But nowhere in the deal has the United States precluded its ability to continue imposing sanctions on those who transfer ballistic missile systems to Iran or provide any kind of technical or material support for those activities. And so the real question is, do the UN restrictions add much to Iranian compliance? And the answer to that is no. Those restrictions have been in place under both Presidents Bush and Obama. The Iranians ignored them all the while. The question, I think, really ought to have been, should we have sacrificed a nuclear deal to constrain a delivery device that only makes sense for nuclear weapons? And I think the answer to that is no. We ourselves, though, will retain the ability to continue addressing Iran's ballistic missile program as well as conventional arms transfers and receipt of conventional arms through our own unilateral sanctions. And I would just note that a lot of people have a lot of great faith in our ability to plunge back into U.S. unilateral sanctions land and force European partners to come on board. Those people similarly, though, somehow doubt our ability to do that in conventional arms and ballistic missile space. And I think that's a question that a lot of pro-sanctions advocates now need to answer. On the issue of PMD, I would disagree that PMD has not been dealt with in the JCPOA. The Iranian obligation was to cooperate with the IAEA to answer questions about PMD. That was the obligation. It was the obligation adopted in Resolution 1747 under George Bush, and it's been the operative effort we've been engaged in. The Iranians have agreed to cooperate with the IAEA. Nowhere in UN Security Council resolutions and nowhere in the NPT does it say that a state that used to have nuclear weapons ambitions now has to confess those nuclear weapons ambitions. If so, then I think we still are awaiting a confession from Switzerland, from Sweden, from Germany, and a number of other countries that have considered it somewhere along the way. I would also just note, and this will be my last comment, I still find this idea of an Iranian confession on PMD to be very curious. A lot of people have pointed to it as PMD being the thing that gives us confidence that the Iranians are in fact on the true and straight path. I will ask it as a hypothetical. Name me one skeptic of this deal who would believe an Iranian confession, even if it was full and absolute and total. Because I don't think there is anyone who would. That's okay. Me neither. And the reason why I don't think that, though, this should hang up the deal is because the transparency and access that we will have going forward with the deal will safeguard against them having such ambition going forward. And that's the important thing.
Bob, to address your question specifically about Iran possibly rejecting the deal, I think it's unlikely, but I do think that we have a real dynamic at work here. We have the hardliners on the U.S. side who have a particular point of view. They don't trust Iran. They want to impose lots of additional limitations on it. They're unhappy about everything that was done, that it falls short of the absolute perfection that they were looking for. Fine. They are making these statements. They're talking on the House floor. They're talking in op-ed pieces. Iran reads those things. They actually are following, they actually have simultaneous translation of the debate on the floor that is being provided by the Voice of America. So if you think that this is all being done in a vacuum and has absolutely no implications for anything, you're really wrong. And the Iranians are pretty smart, actually. They are listening. And their hardliners are saying, oh, well, this is what these guys are saying in the United States. Maybe our answer should be a similar one, because they've done this many times in the past, sort of tit for tat. You do this to us, we'll do that to you. And their modulus, the parliament, is going to be debating these things. They're waiting for us. And they're going to watch what we do and see. The chance that they will turn it down is reduced now that it looks almost certain that the agreement will go through, but it's not over yet. And if they really believe that the next president of the United States is going to rip it up and walk away from it, which nobody on this panel seems to believe that would happen, then they would be even more inclined to take very dramatic steps. So in any event, I think the Supreme Leader has a political balancing act to do. He tries to keep his right wing and his left wing more or less under control. That means that he says things one day and then he changes them and does it a different way the next day. I know that we all would like to have perfect consistency in foreign policy and in our national discussions. It usually doesn't work that way, and especially international politics doesn't. Let me say one quick word to the question that was raised about the fact that Iran gave up Mughasl, who was the guy who was the mastermind of the Khobar Towers event. One person who actually knows something about this, the FBI agent, wrote a piece just today, which you've obviously read, good work, saying that he thought this was a clear sign from Iran that it was prepared to approach things in a different way, that it didn't have to. They've sat on that guy for all of these years, and suddenly, miraculously, he shows up in Lebanon, in Hezbollah territory, is allowed to proceed to Saudi Arabia without any questions being asked and no complaints. Well, was that a signal? My guess is that people who would like to see it as a signal will see it as a signal. A lot of people will not see it as a signal, and they won't see anything that Iran does as a signal.
Maybe just two quick comments, one on past possible military dimensions. I think we're never going to get it cleared up, but as I understand it, the agreement is written, and the way we've approached it is to assume that Iran has warhead design ready to go. I personally do not believe that. I think they need to do a lot more work on it, but we've been conservative. The other side being conservative is you don't have to care about the PMD. But politically it will certainly play in. I think if we had another 4 hours, the whole question of the regional dynamics is really very, very important. I view the arms sales somewhat as just we're being blackmailed as usual, but anyway.
I started out by saying how full of regret I was at at the dishonesty that some have engaged in discussing the JCPOA on both sides. And I find that the enthusiasm to analogize the United States Congress to the Majlis Shura in Iran is one of those offensive tactics that doesn't really work, much as analogizing the President of the United States to the Supreme Leader or to President Rouhani is not really quite the same thing, and I think the White House would rightly be offended were I to suggest that somehow Rouhani and Obama were really pretty much the same kind of guy, just constrained by their right and their left. On the question of PMD, it's a good question, because the reason that people like me care about PMD, of course, is because if you don't know what they had, then how do you verify that they don't have it anymore? It's a real question about verification and baselines, and I can only defer to somebody like Olli Heinonen, who talked about this, or David Albright, who talked about this, both of whose credentials on nonproliferation are substantially better than my own, who have said that this is not a good way to go forward, not a way to set a precedent. But let me just defer to Kerry and Wendy Sherman, who said we need to know what happened. And the bottom line is, we will not know, and I suspect the IAEA will not know either, because of course the Iranians are still cleaning up the site at Parchin. So, does this deal fall short of absolute perfection, and that's why I don't like it, because that was the standard? Yeah, it falls short of absolute perfection, and so does the better deal that I offered. We all understand that you make compromises when you do such things in international policy, okay? The issue is when one side doesn't understand that the compromises that it has agreed to are not acceptable to the other side in a democracy. There should be a decent discussion of those things. I think that there are ways to have them and ways not to. I really appreciate you all being here.
Yeah, thank you. Real quick, just thanking the panel. Just really a pleasure to be on with everybody, and a lot of good points were made. Just wrapping up on the PMD. And Bob and I have spoken about this before. The problem isn't the PMD, what we know, what we don't know. The problem is what I alluded to before. The standards of the deal give so much over the course of 10 years that the enrichment capacity that Iran is going to have at the end of 10 years, it matters what they know. When they get to the point where they're going to have an enrichment capability for a breakout time of 0, it matters what they know. So it comes into play because of the nature of the deal and the extension. Final point on this, the administration, I agree with Danny, started out with good intentions. We knew where Obama was in 2007, 2008 on this. I think it's an honorable goal to try to see Iran become a partner and a player in good standing in the region. Quoting the New York Times editorial board, which I rarely do, the country's ideological hardliners may continue to chant death to America, but there are plenty of young Iranians who see a different future for their country and should be encouraged to build it, unquote. I think everybody in this room agrees with that. My concern with this deal is I think it emboldens the leadership, it emboldens the hardliners, it gives them a huge win on the international stage, and it's just as likely that it's going to embolden that leadership and that regime, and the day for those young Iranians is going to be put off by factors in the region and hardening up of alliances and more military going into the place. It's going to play right into the hands of Iranian hardliners. So that's my problem with the agreement. And again, pleasure being with everybody today.
I'd like to thank the panelists and also thank the members of the audience. And we'll see how it plays out.